pages. But before I go into that, I'd like to recognize the presence of the Austrian embassy. And we have Dr. Katia here. She's been very, very supportive, especially on issues of shelter, access to justice, and we are very grateful, very grateful. Please continue supporting this cause. We also recognize the presence of UNDP. UNDP, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here and continue supporting this cause. We have the Netherlands Embassy in our midst. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Please do not be so humble. Come and tell us that you're here. Yeah, please, please. And we thank you, Honorable, for staying with us. As I said, you're our ambassador. Madam Angela, Commissioner Angela Nakafero, to take us through what is really the heart of today's meeting. Apart from the opening session, this is what is going to ground our discussions. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you very much, Honorable Dora Byamukama. I really stand on the protocol as recognized. And I would also like to note that I've added another title, Dr. Angela Nakafero. You've been part of the journey. I'm grateful for that, ladies and gentlemen. So my task is simple, just to take you through the current status and the prospects of gender-based shelters in Uganda. Basically, really to see where we are starting from in terms of our engagement on the future of these GBV shelters. We've already talked about the legal and policy framework, but I just want to pull out a few which are very critical for us. Can we have the slides, please? Of particular importance to us is the Domestic Violence Act and the regulations, and these provide for the establishment and management of gender-based violence shelters in Uganda, basically to provide safe spaces and required support services. So the image of what we have and the realities of the GBV shelters is a center, a point of convergence for the different services. When a survivor is left on her own or his own, it's not easy to negotiate through and navigate the processes in terms of accessing medical services, in terms of accessing justice services. The processes are very long, and really there's a lot of associated costs in terms of accessing justice. So when they are left on their own, they may not manage that entire process, leave alone the issue of psychosocial support and then mediation back into the communities. So it's a safe space for the survivors, but it's a point of convergence for the most important services that are required, especially taking into account the case in point. Of course, we know that if it's a case of rape, the services vary from the required services for physical violence, and so on and so forth. What's important also to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, is that the declaration of the heads of state and governments within the interconference and Great Lakes region, where it was agreed that we need these spaces for members to start fast-tracking the establishment and scaling up GBV shelter services in the region. Uganda, we are doing relatively well compared to others, but of course, we need to improve. There are so many areas where we need to improve in terms of delivery of GBV shelter services. The National GBV Policy 2016 and Action Plan also provide for the establishment and management of the GBV shelters. And we've just reviewed the guidelines on establishment and management of the shelters. And of course, we are also adding the component of sustainability. As the national machinery, we welcome partners in terms of supporting us to establish and manage, but we are also saying that the issue of sustainability is critical, because we don't want to reach a point where we watch the shelters being closed. That shouldn't happen. So once we establish, we want the shelters to be sustained for them to deliver the much needed services. Really, as part of the background, a lot has already been said, but the initial shelters were established as part of the UN Joint Program on Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. That was between 2010 and 2015. We also had the learning experience to South Africa and Rwanda and Sierra Leone, whereby Ugandans benchmarked what's happening in other countries, and on coming back, they were able to see the model that we needed to take as a country. Currently, our shelters, we have two different major priorities. One is the advisory center, where we offer a range of services to the survivors, but also a facility for accommodation and providing temporary refugee in case the survivor is not able to stay with the relatives, and we don't want to escalate the harm that may come out of the process. We are also thinking about a model which is easier to establish and cheaper to maintain. And of course, a one-stop center is a model that we would want to adopt, but of course, working closely with the model of the GBV shelters as they are right now. So what are the roles of the stakeholders in the establishment and management of the GBV shelters? As I noted from the beginning, ours is a tripartite arrangement. Tripartite in terms of having our development partners supporting us, government, both central and local government, stepping in. And I would like us to take a moment and really appreciate the local governments that are supporting the GBV shelters. I know Queen is leading because Queen really did a lot in terms of the constructing of the shelter. The local government allocates resources on a quarterly basis as a contribution to the shelter, but also providing the human resources required to manage the shelter. So for us as a ministry, Queen district is so far our model, and I know other districts are also coming up. Masaka is coming up. Local government is really playing a critical role. We are also witnessing other local governments coming in really in a big way to support and own the shelters, and that partnership we really celebrate. The third partner is that of the civil society organization. As noted from the beginning, almost all our shelters, we have an active non-government organization running the day-to-day work of the shelters. So we really appreciate our stakeholders, the civil society organization, for working with us to ensure that we deliver services. So already, Honorable Dora has noted that our local governments are providing the space, both land, physical infrastructure. Some of them contribute towards the utilities. This is the case in Mbarara, Queen. Some of them are also seconding staff to work with the shelters. Most of the CDOs represented here are playing a very critical role. Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you're here so that we combine our efforts in terms of sustaining the shelter. The development partners, EU, UN agencies, UK Aid, Netherlands, USAID through the Center for Disease Control, OCA, Refugee, all these development partners that are putting in a lot in terms of the financial resources, but also working closely with the district leadership and the NGOs in the managing of the day-to-day work. The central government, represented by the Ministry of Gender, Labour, Social Development, is leading in terms of setting standards and supervising the GBV shelter delivery services, especially in terms of quality assurance, coordination. We are also stepping up our efforts in terms of mobilizing resources. For some of the districts represented here, of the last 4 to 3 years, we've had efforts in mobilizing resources for the sustainability of the shelters. So NGOs are managing the day-to-day services, and of course we celebrate this. Thank you very much. We need to clap for ourselves. Thank you. So when it comes to the numbers, currently we have 20 GBV shelters in the country. Bwaise, we have 2 in Kampala, Bwaise and Ntinda. Bwaise is under the direct management of ActionAid Uganda International. Ntinda under the direct management of Uganet. Mubende, local government, and with the support of CDC, as well as Masaka, local government with the support of CDC. In Mbarara, the district local government is supporting and playing a critical role, but it's a shelter that requires additional support. Tororo is basically Mifumi, taking lead. Kumi is ActionAid, Palisan Katakwi, ActionAid. Kweni is where local government is really leading in terms of the management of the shelter. Kamulya Namutumba, we have Uganda Women's Network. Guru Amur Nebi is ActionAid. Nyonga is we are working closely with Women Rights Initiative. This is in Jinja. And then LEADER, local government, and INET. Moroto, Amdat, and Terego, we are working closely with UN agencies. So in total, these are 20 GBV shelters located in different parts of this country. Most of the shelters have a capacity of 20, they can accommodate 20 at the minimum. And of course, these 20 can be really accommodated and provided with additional support services. In terms of accommodation, in total we have 263. That is the total number of GBV survivors who can be accommodated in all these GBV shelters. Funding of the shelters is really where we have a challenge. There's minimal operations in 12 shelters. And of course, I wouldn't want to say that they're on the verge of closing because local governments are stepping in, but the operations are really very minimal. And of course, when we don't have financial resources, it affects the kind of services that we can deliver in those shelters. We also have 2 of them whose funding is guaranteed up to the end of this year. And of course, after next year, there are issues regarding funding. 12 our shelters are assured of funding up to 2023, and then 3 assured of funding up to 2024. So, ladies and gentlemen, 2024 is not far from now. So we need to really hype up our game in terms of mobilizing resources for the sustainability of all these shelters. They're delivering critical services to the survivors, and we've been challenged that we need to look at the shelters from the eyes of the survivors, not necessarily the structures, but the survivors who are accessing services through these shelters. To date, we've managed to provide support services to over 79,695 survivors. And you find that it's a package where we have accommodation, psychosocial support, supporting through the just access to justice, mediation with the family, and of course, in ideal situations, reuniting the survivor with a family after engaging the family to be able to reduce the level of violence in those homes. A total of 68,141, that is 61%, of the cases have been resolved through mediation, court rulings, referrals, and counseling. Of these, 18,680 survivors reported instances of violence, and of course, this was in the lockdown. Uganda was never spared with the lockdown, and GBV was one of the epidemics that accompanied COVID. A total of 665 women across 5 districts have also benefited from entrepreneurship development skills, and they've been supported to start agro and non-agro income generating activities. So far, the baseline that has been done indicates that they've been able to at least improve their incomes to a certain level that they can be sustain their lives and the lives of their families. I would want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, the aspect of economic empowerment as a strategy towards prevention and responding to cases of violence. When women have a source of income, they're able to provide basic needs, and some of them can access justice, and also that decision to move on is also very, very important. We all know that a beggar has no choice. When you rely on your spouse to give you everything, there's little room for you to make a decision on your next step of action, even in instances of grave gender-based violence. What are some of the key challenges? Some of these have already been outlined. I just want to emphasize limited physical space is our major challenge. And of course, I really would want to see sustainable funding to the shelters. The numbers of land-related cases is overwhelming, and this at times goes beyond physical or sexual abuse to families losing their homes and losing their lives. There are also high expectations from our survivors vis-a-vis the available support. Some of them would want to have at least an adequate amount of money to be able to start their income generating activities, but what we can provide is really dictated with what is available. As a country, we've managed to improve reporting of gender-based violence in this country from 36.9% in 2016 to the current 70%. For me, it's a big achievement. However, there are cases that are never reported. And of course, we also need to strengthen our work in terms of reporting and improving the services that come along with reporting. Okay. Delayed reporting of cases is also an issue. And of course, inadequate human and financial capacity of the GBV shelters to provide the services in an integrated approach. So what is the strategic direction we would want to take as a ministry? We've tried our level best to mainstream the GBV shelter service delivery in our third national development plan and within our 5-year strategic plan, 2021-2025. But the economic recess we are going through has not made it easy for us to really be able to get adequate resourcing from central government. We've started conversations with the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development in terms of ensuring that we get additional support for the GBV shelters and GBV work. And I'm glad that for the new projects that we are working with the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, there's a bigger component on GBV prevention and response. We hope through this we'll be able to mobilize more resources from central government, but also from our development partners. We would also like to establish a one-stop center in Kampala which can serve as these are the 20 GBV shelters when it comes to those very complicated cases that may not be easily covered well by the GBV shelters. Supporting reporting of cases, ladies and gentlemen, we've upgraded Sauti. Previously, Sauti was only managing cases of violence against children. We've upgraded it in terms of the capacity to handle cases of violence, and all of us can use Sauti to report cases of violence and be able to access some resources. Thank you. My prayer today and our prayer, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need additional financial support to the GBV shelters to ensure continuity of services for the survivors, but also ensuring that we are able to coordinate this important work more effectively. I know we've done much in terms of the legal and policy framework. We are stepping up our work in terms of social norm change. We are strengthening coordination and also working with all different agencies to provide a multi-sectoral approach, but all these require financial services. So this is our prayer, and your contribution, your guidance on this is much appreciated. Thank you very much. Over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner Dr. Angela Nakafero, for that presentation. I think now we are much more clearer on where we are at and the impact that the shelters have had in Uganda. Thank you very much for that presentation. Very informative. I'll just highlight a few points. The first one is that in the national plan. I think for me that shows government commitment, and I hope and pray, given the magnitude of cases, for example, of teenage pregnancy, this aspect will be prioritized in the National Action Plan. Because it's very important that we address some of these issues where the shelters are significant. We've also heard about the challenges, limited physical space, sustainable funding, and high expectations. So these are some of the areas where we need to focus when we are thinking about how best to intervene. So I will leave it at this, and I'd like to move on to the next presentation, which is the keynote address, and it's on resourcing for gender-based violence interventions by Urgent Action Fund. It will be delivered by Ms. Jean Kemitare, Program Director, Urgent Action Fund. So in effect, apart from getting information, we are going to get skills on how to do it wherever we are. I think this is a very important component of today's deliberations and meeting. Before I invite Jean to make the presentation, I'd like to recognize, as I said before, the presence of Chief Administrative Officers. We have Chief Administrative Officers here. Please stand up for recognition. You are very important because you are the ones who are in charge of money. Thank you for being with us. You are very, very important persons, as you know, when it comes to issues of budgeting and resource allocation. So we take your presence very seriously. Unfortunately, we are not able to introduce ourselves in the morning one by one, partly because of time constraints and the way we are seated. But I want to acknowledge that we have also Deputy Community Development Officers who are here. Please stand up for recognition. District, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering why I would have a deputy. Thank you. Yeah. So these are from different districts. Mubende. If you are from Mubende. I was told Mubende is here. Nebi. Mubende is here. Nebi. Thank you. This is now roll call. Rira. Amuru. Where's Amuru? Okay. Okay. Where are you? You're here. Oh, welcome. Welcome. Tororo. Itienedi. Aha, good. We're glad to have you. Katakwi. Oh, welcome. Yoga. If you speak the language, you must. If you work there. Kumi. Yeah, thank you for being here. Palisa. Quen. Palisa, thank you. Quen. Thank you very much. Oh, our very own. Thank you very much for being here. Yeah. Amudat. Amudat is not here. I was reminding Minister of Gender that we also have Kalasi girls. It is not listed as a shelter, but it maybe should, because they do provide services. It's a school. Yeah, Kalasi girls. Yeah. We have Tororo. We have Moroto. Welcome. Yeah, welcome. We have Kamuli. Yes, we can see you. You're welcome, sir. Namutumba. You're welcome. We have Ginger. She has gone out. Thank you for that information. Masaka. Thank you for being here. And we have Mbarara. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. So as you can see, this is a very small fraction of the districts of Uganda. So Minister of Gender, you have a lot of work to do. Because I know there are more than 156 districts. Am I right? Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do. So I'd like to stop here and invite Madame Jean Kemitare, Program Director, Urgent Action Fund, to equip us on how best we can resource for GBV interventions. Thank you very much for being with us.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Dora. All representatives of embassies present, UN agencies present, government ministries, departments and agencies, honorable members of parliament present, representatives of district local government, and I would like also to echo the country director of Action Aid while recognizing her presence on the importance of recognizing and honoring the survivors that are here present. All protocol observed. I stand here not only in the capacity of someone representing a Pan-African Women's Fund, but also as someone who has been part of Ugandan civil society for the past 15, 16 years, 12 of those in GBV prevention and response. So I'm speaking on many technical and passion fronts as I speak to the issue of funding for GBV shelters, which I recognize and I really do appreciate the fact that we are talking about this now as part of integrated gender-based violence prevention and response, because there is no one arm that is better or stronger than the other. We need prevention as much as we need response. In as much as we increase our prevention efforts, we do then get survivors coming up, and we need to have safe and ethical services for them, including shelters, because many of them are unable to stay in the very environments that are violating them. Next slide, or who's doing the slides? Okay, next slide. So, talking about funding, I thought it was important for us to unpack what is the funding ecosystem, or who is in the funding ecosystem. An ecosystem is, a codependent set of actors and factors that constitute a whole. And for funding, there are many actors, but I would like to talk today about the category of funders that we have globally and in Africa. I think it's important to understand this if we are talking about financing for GBV shelters, and we want to increase sustainable funding for GBV shelters. The first thing is, who is the audience that we are going to engage with in order to increase this funding? So we have bilateral agencies, and happy to recognize the role of Swedish Embassy, the SIDA, who are actually one of our funders ourselves, including on GBV work. Then we have multilateral agencies like the UN agencies, the World Bank and others. Local and national governments, and we've just been speaking about the incredible role that Ugandan local government is playing in funding and facilitating shelters. We have what we call public and private foundations. So Comic Relief is a public foundation. Ford Foundation, many of you are familiar with Ford Foundation and Comic Relief, that's why I picked those, is a private foundation. Private, someone, a high net worth individual, then starts a fund or a philanthropy to support various areas of social justice and charitable engagements. Then we have the private sector, and this is coming up as an interesting funder in the whole ecosystem of funding. While there are some that have contestations about getting funding from a private or a corporation whose wealth is being generated through a whole range of means and processes, some of which are thought to be exploitative, they are actually emerging as an important funder, and even in the recent Gender Equality Forum, they did contribute substantially. And I've picked some examples of those that I've heard and seen doing some funders. Chanel, for ladies, you know, the bags and all the, you know, the fashion house. And I don't know how to pronounce that word, but they produce jewelry. I know for a fact that they've funded a range of initiatives, and there are so many others. Of course, faith-based organizations, and there are faith-based foundations like a Tier Fund. Then there are women's funds, what we call women's funds, like Where I Work, whose core role is, you know, to bridge the gap between big funders and women's rights organizations. And as I go forward in my presentation, you'll see why. Then there's also the emergence of this important funder who is high net worth individuals. I'm sure many of you in this room are high net worth individuals. These are individuals with some amount of money that then contribute to charitable causes, not within an institution, but they pick money and say, I'm giving back. They ask someone to do research on who they should fund, and they fund. For example, Mackenzie Scott, the wife of, ex-wife, sorry, of, is it Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk? Anyway, did that kind of donation to many women's funds, including ourselves. She gave us a donation of $5 million US. Just given, no reports, no pressure, no conditionalities. Go and implement. Well, of course you have to report, but not the kind of reporting that you're thinking about. So those are also emerging as interesting funders within that ecosystem that I think we should pick interest in, given the way the context is shaping out. Then I also like to recognize that we have other type of philanthropies. Most of the time when we are thinking of funding, we are thinking of institutionalized funding that all the above do, except the high net worth individuals. However, to recognize that there are diverse philanthropies, for example, when there is a crisis, anything, say the floods that just happened, the people in the community are the first responders. And somebody, I don't know if it was the Action Aid country director, who spoke to the fact that resourcing or support is not just financial. And so there are people at the community that do provide support, and we've been hearing about innovative support that is not necessarily monetary, and I would like us to recognize that and think about it as we are thinking about sustainability. Next slide. All right, so it's important to know the context we are in. So that's the actors in the funding ecosystem. What's the context in which funding is operating right now if we want to heighten the financial sustainability of shelters? The context is marked by limited resources, but I personally don't believe it is limited resources. I think it's limitations in prioritization and limitations in trickle down. So we all know that prioritization that's given to gender equality issues, that also affects the issue of gender-based violence response, including setting up shelters. But we also know that in most cases it is women's rights organizations that are running shelters, and their ability to apply for and receive large pots of funding that may be seen as needed to run shelters may be limited due to the modalities of funding. And by modalities, I mean all these applications, what you need to have in place, so practices, systems, and processes for structuring resources. These determine who gets bigger funding. And so colleagues like Action Aid will be able to get a bigger pot than another colleague, or maybe Queen District Local Government who is running a shelter. The larger pots of money are held by government and public sector institutions. Again, where do the shelters fall in that, and how can they strategically position themselves, given that that's a fact that's not going away right now, to access that funding? What kind of partnerships should those who run shelters think about in order to access bigger pots of money? Then, of course, you know, as someone was talking about the politics of money in the household, the lack of choice in the household, is the same in the funding ecosystem. Of course, power is balanced to where the larger sums of money is, geographical locations, and this shapes the narrative and practice of funding. And then there's a push for evidence. What's the evidence that what you're doing works? There's a push for scaling up. How do we know that what you're doing is able to be scaled up at national level or at bigger levels? And there is a push for sustainability. And in talking about sustainability, I want to pick again on what the Country Director of Action Aid said around sustainability in the eyes of the survivor. I always have questions when I get these pushbacks. Is this the same sustainability we think about when we are talking about prevention and response of malaria, prevention and response of tuberculosis? Because, you know, gender-based violence has been recognized as a public health challenge. So what are the lenses in which we are analyzing sustainability? And what is the thinking outside the box that we are willing to engage in to support sustainability, those of us pushing for sustainability? And then also in the context, the amounts that are given and expected to push social change are usually not that much, and therefore have limitations on the kind of social change that's expected. There's a general fatigue on providing admin costs, and so a lot of times funding will come without admin costs. And I was really excited to hear about a district local government that's providing human resource. That's really commendable, because that's becoming a limitation within the funding ecosystems. And there are also challenges in accessing funding for infrastructure. A shelter is a house, it's a safe house in a safe location with big land and with other activities. That is infrastructure. Then at the macro level, we have a lot of changes that are going on that are affecting demographics, that are affecting socio-economic, technological, and political spheres. We know the impact of COVID, and we are still reeling from post-COVID challenges. Then the war between Russia and Ukraine, global inflation, the emergence of digital currencies, and so many other changes on the macroeconomic level that impact funding. So, you know, there are also bilaterals that have actually had to cut the funding that they give for certain issues as a result of these developments in the macroeconomic environment. I mean the macro environment. Then we have invisibilized, because we have been thinking a lot about institutionalized funding, institutionalized philanthropy. We have invisibilized different ways of non-monetary or non-institutionalized funding or resourcing that we can actually tap into There are examples here and beyond of chiefs, local leaders, religious leaders' houses acting as shelters, actually. They get survivors that come to their places and they don't turn them away, despite the conditions within their own households. Next slide. So I also thought it would be important for us to have the statistics or a picture, mental picture around the state of financing for gender and for gender equality and for gender-based violence. And I've picked analysis of OECD funding or ODA funding and Generational Equality Forum pledges that have been made by or compiled by Mama Cash, that's one of the oldest women's funds, and another international women's agency called AViD. In an analysis of ODA funding from 2017 to 2018, 153 billion USD was committed, or 42% of ODA funding was focused on gender equality and women's empowerment. 1% of that, I said 1% of that funding that was focused on gender equality was committed to women's rights organizations. That is 198 million. Again, let's reflect back on who holds and administers most of the shelters. And now I'm talking about 1% of gender-focused ODA funding going to women's rights organizations. Between 2014 and 2019, development programs addressing violence against women and girls received 0.002% funding of net ODA by members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. Between 2016 and 2018, funding to violence against women and girls programming accounted for 0.12% of all humanitarian funding. So even as we are thinking of sustainability, of financing, and so on, it's good to get a picture of what slice of the pie we are talking about. Good news is that the UN put forward the Generation Equality Forum, whose main forums were last year, to drive urgent action on gender equality, having had 25 years of progress, but more progress could be had. At the 2021 forum, $40 billion was pledged by governments, public sector institutions, private sectors, and so on. Of course, as I mentioned, the largest pledge was by governments and public sector institutions, 21 billion, 13 billion by the private sector, 4.5 billion by philanthropic institutions, and 1.3 billion by UN entities and international and regional organizations. We are still waiting to see how those pledges will unfold and accountability around those pledges. There have been some rumblings about some of the pledges actually being old pledges, but repackaged for that forum. But that's, I think, a conversation for another day. The preliminary analysis of those pledges sees 5%, 2 billion, has been pledged to women's rights organizations, and the same question is how much of that will trickle down to GBV shelters. So across the continent, we have similar patterns and some inspirations, and of course, we've just heard about the inspirations in Uganda, piloted by the government of Uganda and other partners. In Kenya, which happens to be the GBV Action Coalition lead, out of 47 shelters in the country, 2 are managed by the state. In Malawi, there are shelters that exist. Some used to receive funding from the state, but that ceased, as we saw the funding that is going to cease in some of the shelters that were mentioned. This is the same case in Malawi. In Botswana, currently, there is no state funding to shelters, although there are few. In Zimbabwe, most shelters are donor funded. In Uganda, we talked about it, the innovations by the district local governments, although the funding is mainly donor-driven and not sustainable. In Rwanda, we have the one-stop centers that are being, managed by the government or spearheaded, rolled out and managed by the government. And we've had a discussion by the Commissioner on the importance of one-stop centers and the intention to start that here, which is commendable. Thank you so much. In South Africa, similar to here, there's a national strategic plan on GBV and femicide. That now has a budget and a unit in presidency for monitoring, a multi-stakeholder unit in the presidency for monitoring. And the government provides some NGOs funding to run and manage shelters. With all that, there's of course the reflection on the gap between policy and practice. We can have policy in place, but implementation will remain a dream unless we follow that policy with seriousness about funding the policy. And many of our countries have had a lot of policy, which is a great start, but we now want action, and somebody talked about walking the talk, putting our mouths where the money is in terms of shelter and other GBV prevention and response. So I have a few recommendations, and I'm sure in the discussions we'll talk about more. One is political will and commitment, and at many different levels. You've seen the amount of funding that I'm talking about. At national level, we've had the presentation of the Commissioner, the funding status, and many different levels. And I would like to remind us that gender-based violence is being recognized as a public health, social policy, and human rights challenge that requires urgent action. And this affects the development of nations. One of the important things, as I've just been talking about, is continuing advocacy. We have strategies, we have mainstreaming in the National Development Plan. We need urgent advocacy on funding for shelters. I was reflecting as I was speaking about this because yes, global inflation and the recession has affected funding for government, for all other institutions, but I go back to the issue of priority. And I was remembering in my early CSO days, I was involved in chronic poverty work and social protection advocacy, where we're advocating for cash transfers, and that sounded unsustainable, unrealistic, but it's, we started, or the government actually, together with then DFID, started with some pilot districts, and at that time DFID funded that project to provide cash transfers on a monthly basis to the aged who are among the most chronically poor. While that happened for a number of years, the pilot, it came to a point where it was agreed that government should then also be part of this and fund. And that has happened and rolled out to the rest of the country, cash transfers to the aged. So people over 80 receive cash transfers. I think that is something that can inspire us among the sustainability for shelters conversation. Another set of recommendations, it's important to have diversification of funders because the context that we've spoken about affects us in different ways. So if we are relying on government or bilateral agencies, things can also shift. If we are relying on high net worth individuals, things can shift. So I think a whole combination of funders is important. I am seeing an interesting emergence of high net worth individuals. I know there's an African Philanthropy Forum with high net worth Africans. I'm not really sure of how they are rolling out philanthropy, but I know that is there, and in fact they will be meeting, and I'm willing to tell colleagues in UN Women who to contact here in Uganda who will be going for that meeting. And they also have some of their wives who have started giving, like Strive Masiwa's wife, I forgot her name, has been giving. That's an interesting line to consider. But as I said, if we need to have a diversification because the context affects any single actor in different ways. And these shelters are an urgent need that we cannot relegate to, if we have money, we shall run it. If we don't have money, we will not run it. After we've done all this prevention, we have women who are now aware and with nowhere to go. We've heard that some are taking shelter in police stations and many other different places, which then heightens their vulnerability. The one-stop center model was talked about. That would be make things, I think, easier, because there are some areas that receive more funding than others, like health response. Exploring different philanthropies, community-based initiatives, and what communities can give and support. And then advocacy. I'm going to talk about context mapping and forecasting last. We need to think outside the box, because the funding terrain is not easy and it's getting more complicated. But if we are talking about sustainability, then we need to be able to push and support out-of-the-box ideas. For example, an endowment fund. That's a fund that's invested, it makes profit, and that profit runs the shelter. So if we are committed to sustainability, let's commit to it all the way, and engage in what it requires to achieve sustainability, which is not cheap. So an endowment fund is one of the suggestions that I'm making. Then also we need to invest in advocacy to transform funding modalities, because as you could see from the statistics, actually finances do exist. It is the modalities, the processes, the systems in which they are disbursed that means that certain groups will access them and others will not. And given that that's a fact, yes, we are doing advocacy to transform it, but in the immediate, what are the strategic partnerships we can engage in for that? Lastly, I'll say, colleagues, I work in a funding agency. Fundraising is a job. Most of our organizations, agencies, pile the same fundraising role in the same person who is doing counseling, the same one who is the admin, and maybe the ED, the same ED, or the head. We don't have headspace and time to fundraise. Fundraising includes the ability to be able to map the context, forecast, because all those things I've said that are developed, how are we forecasting? Even ourselves were asking, how are we forecasting around these macro contextual issues that we are seeing, because they will bring some changes to them. So we need to invest in capacity and human resource for fundraising. If we are serious about raising money, it's a full-time job of someone. It's not Evelyn who is doing this, that, the other is also writing proposals, looking for calls, looking for what. It's a whole intelligence you have to do. If you look at these agencies who are able to access those big monies, it's an entire machinery that they have. People who are able to do this forecasting and context mapping, people who are able to sell, okay, who is who in this funding pool that has come out, what are their interests? Because that's important. People who are able to make relations. Unfortunately, I hate to tell you, but funding is relational. So people who are able to make relations. Then those who are able to write the proposals. And really, most of us, our jobs, it's one person who is doing that, and think about the sustainability or the reality of that. We need to really invest in technical expertise in terms of fundraising, and give that person headspace to do their job and not pile on them other responsibilities. Thank you so much. Mine was to spark interest, to spark a conversation, to push us out of our comfort zones, because I think a lot of times that's where we are. To tell you that, yes, funding is limited, but again, funding is available. We need to get strategic, creative, innovative, and also partner with people who we know are sustainable, like government. Government is a sustainable institution, whether it is who or what in government, around funding and scaling up some of these initiatives. So thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion, and I look forward to where we'll end with this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madame Jean Kemitare. Thank you. Let's give her another round of applause. In all fairness, what she has presented in about 30 minutes record time is is content which we actually pay for. This is content you pay for. So Jean, you have given us your intellectual information for free, as it were, and we are very grateful. And for this kind of talk, you can actually pay as much as even like $300 plus. So these slides and the information she has shared, I would like to propose that you share it with everybody here, especially with our CAOs and our district officials, because it not only applies to the Ministry of Gender, but it also applies to the district local governments, because this is how you can fundraise. You don't have to look to government for sources, whereas you can partner, you can do all this. I liked a lot of what you said. I keep on going to that particular word, political will. I've been interrogating it. I'm doing my PhD too. Now I'm thinking, political will. What is this political will? I think we need to unpack it. What is political will? I know we have a politician here, Honorable Namuga. What is political will? But for me, having been in politics for 15 years, I think political will is not really a mystery. Politics goes with numbers, it goes with interests. And politicians will be swayed by these two. If the numbers and the interests coincide, then the language will change. So when it comes to prioritization, we need to make this issue of sexual violence, GBV shelters, so critical, so very important, and explain it in different ways. Whether we use figures, facts, it all will build political will and change perception. But it's a thing we can always discuss, and we should discuss and unpack. It should not remain a mystery. Jean, I can't repeat what you said. I wouldn't even try. I go to meetings where someone talks and someone tries to repeat. If I try to dance, you danced, I might dance it badly. But since we are all here, I will not try. But just to say thank you very much. That was excellent. That was very good. So now we've talked enough. I will just keep quiet now. It's a plenary discussion. Can we discuss? And then towards the end of our discussion, we shall take off some time and put this question to you. Even as you discuss, you could bring it up. What is your commitment to sustain and support GBV shelters in Uganda? We are not only talking about money, we are talking about resources in a wholesome manner, because resources are financial, they are physical, it's equipment, and it's intellectual. All that is resource. So now we are now going to discuss. After hearing the opening session, after hearing the status and impact, where do we go from here? And now I'm calling upon you to raise issues you'd like to raise at this point in time. Honorable Namuga, I'm eyeing you because I know politicians always have something to say. Can we have another microphone which will go around, please? I think it will be better. And can you come with a sanitizer? We're still in that time. Angela, can you please help? Let's see whether I have a sanitizer here. Yes? Oh, this is a small one. How will it work here? Let's just use this as I think we're having a problem at the back. Maybe you can put it far. Honorable, please.
Thank you, Honorable. I think I will